Thank you for joining us for another episode of Attribution Nation. In this current series, we're stepping into the C-suite to hear directly from CMOs navigating today's most complex marketing challenges. From AI disruption to the age-old alignment battles with sales, we'll unpack the reporting and data problems leaders are solving for today. And quite frankly, the ones that still keep them up at night as well. So join us for candid conversations that go beyond metrics into the strategies, experiments, and lessons shaping the future of marketing leadership. And today I am joined by Tiffany Holland, the founder and head of marketing and media strategy at Consiglieri. And in this episode and interview, we're going to be talking about how she uses data to drive strategy and build smarter marketing orgs, and also uncovers the why behind performance. So Tiffany, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. So let's just start with the basics. Tiffany, tell us a little bit about how you got into marketing and a little bit about your career path.
Sure. Yeah, mine is not a straight shot. It's kind of varied along the way. I started on the agency side way back in Web 1.0 land, working in professional services. It wasn't necessarily a marketing job per se, but it was helping marketing organizations stand up e-commerce websites and things that they had never thought about doing before. And so it was very cutting edge at the time. Right now it sounds like a relic. At the time it was very cool, very big deal. I found it really interesting and fascinating, and that was my degree coming out of University of Washington, was information systems and marketing, and kind of the marriage of those two. So through college, I sort of found that intersection, and then found an internship and agency and grew from there. And then it was on the agency side for a while, got a little burned out being in tech side of things, just with nightly deployments and all that comes into tech development. And so then I decided it'll be much easier on the client side. So I got a job at Nordstrom, running specialty websites for them, incubating for their BP department and their designer department. And that was a really fun, cool opportunity, but it sort of then led into, we were transforming the website. That led into more kind of transformational roles, and then sort of started the next phase of my career, which was, okay, if you're on the cutting edge of things, how do you then bring that into the sort of get that adopted by the main body and become part of the main way to operate? And so that was a big focus of my job. I had different roles and different marketing roles, but the whole point of it was to take whatever they were doing and transform it and modernize it to be more effective. So whether it was men's marketing, beauty marketing, women's marketing, getting everybody to talk together. And then it was sort of channel focused of, hey, we're way over indexed on catalog. How do we rebalance the mix, and what's the right way to do that? I then moved from there over to T-Mobile and was doing very similar things, kind of on the opposite end. Like instead of being too retention focused, we're too acquisition focused. And how do we start to rebalance our activities and our channels and our spend? And then from there, I think the idea was, big companies that have been working and kind of bolting on marketing pieces onto their organization are too siloed, and it's really hard to get things done. So before I go to another organization and just kind of see how I can make incremental change, I was like, could I do it from the outside? And so that's when we started Consiglieri, to really help larger brands act like smaller brands. And if they were to start over, how would they do it? And obviously ideally they're not blowing everything up to do that. We're kind of seeing that lately with AI being that catalyst. So we're going to blow everything up and operate differently. But how do we do it in a smart way? And how do we leverage the goodness that we have, but then kind of remove the blockers and move things forward?
Nice. Very cool. Very cool. I could probably ask you a million questions just about your background, but we've got to keep it focused. So I'm going to stick to the script here, at least for a little bit. And we're going to talk a little bit about data. And, when we had our last call, we spoke last, we talked a lot about turning data into strategic action. And you shared a little bit about how, in your past, you've been, the person that takes the data and then uses the data to inform action. You're not the one that's actually been collecting and curating the data.
Hmm.
So, what I'd love for you to share with with our listeners here is how you take data and interpret that data and turn it into insights, and then turn those insights into real world decisions. So, like how you figure out using data, like do we stay the course or do we pivot? So I know we talked about this a lot, but I want you to share it with our listeners. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, that is definitely a big part of what I've been doing for currently and for the last, I don't know, 10 plus years. Yeah, when you mentioned that, the first thing that popped up was time at T-Mobile. And there was a lot of briefs coming through that I was either directly involved with or just kind of listening and in more of a consultative mode. And I noticed a theme within them, which was there was kind of a new launch or a new something new on carrier moment that we were talking about. But then it was like, but we also got to get these benefits in here, the benefits of the offering. And there's a ton of benefits. So I was like, well, okay, which ones do you choose? And they always tried to cram in, as many as possible. And we would have conversations about that and why these benefits and why not something, why for this audience or why for this campaign. And a lot of times there was a lot of information, but the more you picked at it, the more there was like, well, I don't know, we haven't talked about them in a while. Or I don't know, it kind of felt like there was like a little signal that might feel like, well, this audience might really appreciate and knowing about this benefit that happened. And so it felt very loose and it felt like there's this huge opportunity here that we could get a lot smarter about what we're doing if we understood that better connection of which audience segments really benefit or really understand, like, do they even understand that they have these benefits, and which ones do they feel like resonate to them, so that when we go and acquire new customers, we could talk about some of those things and start to bundle them together. This was not something that anybody was asking for. It was just more of a general pet peeve of mine that I felt like we were wasting time or that people were just dumping in extra information into briefs that was not being leveraged in the right way. So I was able to convince some of my peers to say, hey, could we run creative learning agenda to really kind of figure out what would resonate best? And so, it's not really leveraging the data. It's like starting with a hypothesis. Like, what do we think is really going to resonate with each? Let's try some different things. We can use our social platforms to do very specific testing, messaging testing, and learn very quickly to be a proxy for other things that we would do. And so it was fascinating. There was kind of the hypothesis or the common sense things of what I thought would work. And then what actually came out of it was actually new insights that became very helpful for us in determining the biggest learning, I think, was that we had launched these benefits over time and then launched and left them, and people really had no idea that it was part of their offering. So learning one was, hey, for retention efforts, we really need to be not just launching and leaving, but continuing to talk about these things. And then as you looked at different age demographics and different life stages, not surprisingly, different benefits, like travel benefits, were better for people who were, in kind of their mid 30s, but also people older who, had time to travel more. So it was not necessarily this for that, which I think was a lot of people's expectations, that, this benefit for this person, and it's a one-for-one relationship. It was, if you, A, it's good to just talk about them, period, and B, it's good to kind of bundle them together in a story that makes sense and they appreciate it. And so again, it's like what we learned out of that, what I just said was absolute common sense. Probably didn't need to test it to learn that thing, but it's also very helpful to have the data behind it to say not just does it work, but by how much. And we could then, the way we set up the testing was they could learn, well, if I add this benefit, it adds this much value to the consideration for them joining. And if I add this one plus this one, just kind of that ABC testing. And it became something that we began to leverage throughout. It changed the process of how we brief. Like, people didn't just dump in benefits. They were able to come back and leverage this data and sort of pick and choose and get smarter about how we work. And so, yeah, that was one example. But I'm constantly surprised of like just having this idea of a creative learning agenda as part of just standard business operations or as part of any campaign is not something that really most companies that I talk to that I've either been a part of or have talked to leverage. which is surprising and not surprising at the same time.
Agreed, agreed. There's a couple things that I think I want to comment on from your response is number one, thank you for reminding me that I need to go check out what my benefits are for my cell phone provider because I have no
It's a
idea
lot.
and I don't use any of them. So thank you for the reminder. I'm going to go do that tonight. Love what you said about how nobody was asking for this, but we did it anyway. That I think is one of the things that's so important for anybody, whether you're in a marketing strategy role or the person that's creating and curating the data or analyzing the data, anybody that's involved in this process, if you wait for for somebody to ask you to solve a problem, you're waiting too long. Like that
Mhm.
problem has already become so bad that it's now reached the level that somebody's got to ask for it to be solved. Don't wait. Just, hey, I'm seeing this problem. I want to go solve it. Can I, like, do you mind if I go solve this problem? And like, that's such a great approach for people to take because it puts you, I mean, when you think about it from a standpoint of, you and I have had varying degrees of our careers. Like we've been the people with our hands in the dirt, and now we're both at executive levels and running businesses. As a business leader, I love nothing more than when somebody on my team says, I found a problem that we should address. Can I go do it? That to me is like you are adding so much value to the organization that I think that it's just important to call that out.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I feel like so many people that I've worked with over my career, like that's the part of their job that they love to do, and they would do it hand over fist if they were allowed the time to do it. And I think the problem that we're seeing with maybe why analytics aren't being used as much as they should is the flywheel is broken of like I have an idea, I'm running it through the system, results came out the other end, and I've either had to go before those results came to be able to use them to get smarter, or the budget's changed and like the inputs coming in at the top are like frenetic and changing all the time. So it's impossible if it's like garbage in, garbage out, I feel like is the model that my company is trying to help solve and provide some structure for. But yes, this question comes up all the time. Like, why, you guys have tons of data. Why don't you, why aren't you telling me what I should be doing? And it's like, there's a gap of like, well, where are we trying to go? And do I have the time to, am I sifting through reactive data, or were we proactive in what we were thinking about so that we could get better learnings? Hopefully, if you're doing it right, it becomes expansive, like you were talking about, like, oh my God, there's 50 projects we could be doing. We're not going to do all of them, but like this is now a better problem to have than like, gosh, everything doing 10 things and none of them are working. And like, I don't know what to do next except for whatever the boss tells me to do. That's a
Yeah,
broken, broken
that's
system for everybody involved.
absolutely, absolutely. The other thing I wanted to call out there is I love your comment about how the insight that you found aligned with general logic, right? Those I find it's funny because when we do data analysis for organizations and we come up with analysis with an insight, everybody's like, well, yeah, those are the best ones because it's like everybody thinks like, well, yeah, but you just told us something we already knew. And it's like, no, I didn't tell you something you already knew. I
Mm-hmm.
proved that something you thought you knew is real. And
Yeah.
those are the best insights because when the insight matches the logic, like that that thing is like legit. That's as legit as an insight gets. So you always want to find insights that line up with logic and don't like think about those as like almost like, well, yeah, you good work, you found the easy thing. No. That's the important thing. That is absolutely not just the easy thing. That is the important thing to find because those end up being super actionable because everybody agrees. We already kind of suspected this. Now we've proved it.
Absolutely. And yeah, to your point, if you've got one thing that you did and you proved it worked, okay, that's great. Okay, now what happens when you have 10 things? And now how do I stack rank these things? And how do I decide what is more important? I think what ends up happening is there's a lot of political clout that decides what's more important. Sometimes there's business strategy that decides what's more important, which is helpful. But yeah, we also were we're running tests where, again, big campaign, big moment came through, and it's like I'm calling the old model. It's still the current model, but I'm calling it the old model, which is, everybody brings their work to the table and we look at it and we decide, we have optionality, and the executives, anoint this one, but not this one and this one. And it's like, okay, nobody wants to ask the question of like, well, why? Like, why did you pick this one over that one? Because they don't want to ruffle feathers. And we would always ask the question, okay, great. Like, we gave you 3 right answers. Since we're running it in social, and which is deemed, a lesser channel in some degrees than TV or other things that you're spending more money on, can we run all of them? Because like, if you feel like they're all right answers, we can maybe weight one more than the other, but like, let's get some learnings here. And we did that across probably my tenure, like a dozen campaigns. And, we always had our side bets on the side of like, okay, the executive picked A. Like, do we all think the A is going to win, or do we think something else? And every time, whatever the executive chose as the go-to that we were all to like rally around, never won. The algorithm didn't agree, or the consumers didn't agree. And so it was this idea of like, okay, with this analytics, like, we need them to be expansive and not reductive, because if we're having these reductive processes and then throwing only what we think are the best things out there, you completely limited your impact before you've even started.
The big thing I heard there is that every organization should have a gambling methodology for people to place bets on their marketing campaigns. That's what I
Absolutely.
heard.
Absolutely. It's a whole, side hustle, but it's fascinating because I'd sit in meetings where people are like, oh, high up leader, I've had this experience at this company, therefore I am expert in this area. And I'm like, the technology is changing so fast. And like, especially on the social media side, I mean, the channels popping up, proliferation of all these things. I am smart. I feel like I am a smart person because I know enough to know I don't know everything in these channels. And how could we possibly? And so we need to come up with ways to be able to capitalize on that, not to, come over the top on it. And definitely very few companies are thinking that way. I think a lot of the tech companies are thinking that way, but I don't know that a lot of traditional brands are thinking that way.
I would totally agree. And that's a fantastic segue into our next question and topic is, we talked a lot about what you just mentioned, which is marketing tech, and everything is advancing faster than most organizations can keep up. So you've got a lot of experience building teams around these challenges. So if you had a blank check and zero constraints, how would you structure specifically the data and measurement portion of a marketing department? Let's talk about people, tools, processes. You can, the world is your oyster. Build it the way you want to build it. What does that look like to you, Tiffany?
Sure. Yeah, I think, it's a fun exercise. Unfortunately, it couldn't be just a tech and analytics conversation, and I won't go down the rabbit hole of all the other things that need to be true. I think some of the principles that I would apply to this are, one, I would not have analytics as a separate siloed org from strategy and planning. The two of them have to be in lockstep. Obviously, you can come with your own expertise in how to get each of those things done, but right now I feel like analytics sits as like a center of excellence and gets prioritized, their work accordingly. But they really need to be side by side, because again, if you're saying, here's what I'm trying to do, and then the question of like, well, how am I going to measure that? And like, what is this going to look like in the front end and the back end if those two groups aren't sitting in lockstep? And how am I going to tell this story? Then you're automatically losing a ton of impact and learnings as part of your flywheel. The other principle that I would apply is thinking about just the operating model that has to exist. So when we talked about testing, and right now everything is all siloed, all the technology is siloed, and it's all different areas, and everybody is a kind of channel expert. Some of the things we did at Nordstrom that we're doing, or that we did at T-Mobile, that we're working with some of our tech clients now, is kind of breaking down those silos and thinking about the flywheel that needs to exist of like, okay, what don't I know that I'm trying to learn and kind of find new ways to be relevant in culture and relevant with consumers. And that's one level of marketing. And then once I sort of figure out those nuggets of those great things that's working, I now need to plug it into a team that's, I would call it the growth team, or that's going to amplify what we're doing. So instead of these like big campaign launches that sort of launch and leave and drop, thinking of it more as a flywheel. And so then the measurement around those things, you've got to be, in order to run that appropriately so that you're learning from sort of the incubation team, what insights are going into the amplification team and what media do they need to buy and what messages need to go to those consumers and then what are they learning and how it gets fed back the other way. That structure needs to exist. And then it would be, again, then finding the right tools and technology, not only just to track and aggregate, but also hopefully help synthesize. I feel like there's been a lot of conversation about AI and generative AI and creating imagery. I feel like the conversation really needs to shift to AI is fantastic at helping connect your different internal systems and your technology to be able to unlock those insights, to be able to share with various groups. So their social insights are deep. They shouldn't just live with the social team. They need to be able to access by the strategist. They need to be able to access by the creative group, etc. And so how to use AI to synthesize and pull out, okay, Tiffany marketer doesn't need to know the nitty gritty of how the channel health is working and all of these things, but there are different things and different conversations that are happening with different audiences that she does need to know. And so how do we have people set up the right structure, processes to be able to get at that data, to be able to break down those silos and share it and kind of keep that flywheel moving. So that would be kind of the core there, whether it's a matrix org or all the other different things that go, it still needs to be flexible, but there's kind of some core truths and fundamentals, I feel like, of how a modern marketing organization needs to work in order to really take advantage of the tech. We've had personalization for a long time. We now have AI. We've had a lot of the tech has been ramping up significantly, but the organizations don't have the ability to absorb it and to train and to really change their functions to take advantage of it. And so it can only be as powerful as it's enabled to do for whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish. And if everybody's just running around doing a bunch of things and CMOs don't have insights into what all of the different pieces are and the value that they really have, then it's not a flywheel. I don't know what that is. It's sort of dips and valleys and a lot of information and expertise getting lost along the way.
Yeah, so it sounds like from what you said, it sounds like you don't like the idea of having like a center of excellence for analysis within like the larger organization, but rather having dedicated analysis function within marketing, probably that rolls up under the strategy section and department of marketing, and so that they can be in lockstep with one another, which I think is really good, because what we see a lot of is I think I would generally agree with that, because we see a lot of scenarios where you have a center of excellence of an analyst team that serves the entire business. And when they do that, there's really two things that end up causing issues for marketing. Number one is marketing usually ends up at the bottom of the priority list for that analyst team, because they've got other things that they're working on that are higher priority, from finance and from sales, who always get the priority over marketing, which is, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just saying it's a thing. And then number two is that those analysts typically don't understand marketing. They're business analysts, not marketing analysts. So while they're really good at creating reports and dashboards and really good at collecting and curating data and really good at analyzing that data, they lack the marketing expertise to be able to turn that into actions from a marketing strategy standpoint. Whereas if you have a team of analysts that sits in marketing, either A, they've come from a background in marketing and that's why they got hired to be a marketing analyst, or at a bare minimum, you can train them to have that background that they need because they are a dedicated resource within marketing. Because ultimately, a lot of times what you end up with is, we already talked about the business analyst that doesn't have the marketing context, or you end up with a marketing analyst that doesn't really have the business context. And so you kind of need both, but if I could only have one, I'd rather have the marketing analyst that can translate things into marketing insights and actions versus larger business actions because we've got that other team over there.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like what happens a lot is, again, there's marketing activities happening when they're disconnected. What you end up with is like reactive analysis, where it's like, go sift through the data and find some nuggets. And it's like, that's an impossible task. It's like, it's not setting the analyst up for success. You really need the like, okay, here's what I'm trying to learn. And when I've sat down with analysts before, they're very good about, keeping me honest. Like, okay, I want to learn 10 things. They're like, you're not going to learn 10 things. It's like, what is the one thing? And then maybe we can pull out like a couple other things, or we can go, if you have some questions, we can go sift around and see if we can find some of those things. But yeah, aimless analysis or insight development is just not helpful. We actually got to a point at Nordstrom, which I think was maybe the best version of this that I've experienced at anywhere that I've worked, where before you could submit a brief, you had to sit down with the insights team and kind of fill out a form that was like, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's how much I'm trying to spend. Here's what I'm trying to learn. And is the thing that I'm trying to learn, like, if it goes well and success is met, is it scalable? And so just even like those basic questions really helped. Like whatever I submitted as version 1 was very different after we kind of went through those conversations, and sort of I would say things and they're like, well, how are you going to measure that? And I'm like, oh, that's a good question. And so like we go back and forth on this until we had something that was really grounded in a great insight, was really something that we felt like could add impact. And it's like, oh yeah, and if you gave me some more money, I could really, like, it really has the potential to be expansive and scale. And I was like, this is fantastic. It was another step in the process, but I felt like it was no longer the garbage in, garbage out. It was like, this feels really good. And I would, to the point of like the side betting, I would stake a lot of my own personal money that like, this is going to add value to the organization. And I think having that connection is key to having everyone feel like they have a stake in the game and what they're doing is valuable, and that we're all like working to the larger purpose. When everything gets sort of like I'm doing my thing and then it gets shut down and moved over to something else, or layer this in, or, and it's like, okay, your learning agenda just got screwed up. We're now going to do some things. It might work. I won't be able to tell you why it worked because we just were like pulling levers all the way through and changing things and wasting money, and some stuff came out the other end, and it's impossible to know.
Well, and that's another really good segue into another question, which I was actually going to save this to be the last question, but we're gonna move it up in the
I love
order
it.
here.
We're getting crazy.
We're getting crazy. We're off script now. So you and I talked, and we both agree 100% on this about how the best marketing measurement begins during the campaign planning process, not after. And that's what you're talking about with proactive measurement versus reactive measurement. And you kind of told me a little bit about how you've baked measurement and testing frameworks into the planning process right at the beginning of the planning process, and then how that allows us to, iterate throughout the process and puts us into this mode of being like a creative scientist. So can you share a little bit more about that with the listeners?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is definitely something that is kind of what we feel is a philosophy of modern marketing. And it is a bit of a unicorn. It seems like folks who get into marketing, like they either really love the creative side or perhaps they really love the business side of it, but it's hard to maybe stitch those two things together. But it's really, I think, where the fun is and where you really add the most value. And so I think instead of just saying, okay, I've been given this task, I have this, product that needs to launch and I'm responsible for awareness and this is my role, and somebody else is going to do conversion and performance and somebody else is going to do the email and all. It's really like taking a step back and saying, okay, what is the comprehensive full funnel story that needs to be told? How do we write a brief that is thinking about those things, not just that could be for launch, but what are the pre-learnings and creative and elements that we would need to maybe do some like pre-testing before we just launch this thing that could help inform. So that needs to be baked in here. And then yes, what are the key moments and the big things and the concept that we need, and working with the creatives on that. And then afterwards, we can't just launch and leave it. I get hit up for a lot of ads for like, do you want your performance marketing to work harder without having to change your creative, without having to like do anything? And I'm like, no, I do not. No, thank you. Like everyone has forgotten this is a conversation with people. It happens to be happening a lot of times through digital channels, but you're having a conversation and you need to know. And when you're having a conversation with someone, you can read their face and know what's working, what's not. In this case, we don't have that ability. We can know if they spent time with it. There's other signals that give us that indication, but it's nuanced, and we need to be capturing and analyzing and thinking through all of it. And again, building something that is expansive so that you're not necessarily launching something brand new the next time. It's iterative to the thing that you did before. And you're building a content library of things of modules that you can plug and play and create new things with. It doesn't always have to be a brand new concept. We've spent a lot of time in between big company and starting Consiglieri. I realized as a strategist, like I'm in the strategy layer and the technology is changing so fast. I need to get more in touch with it. So I took a job consulting and running CM and social media, paid advertising, and doing some organic as well for smaller brands that just sort of needed the expertise. And so it was fascinating. They don't have a lot of money to just constantly throw out big, brand new campaigns. And so it is a lot of getting really savvy about thinking through, okay, this ad worked. What are the components of it? How do I break it apart? How do I kind of edit it with an editor or with my own tools and re-edit it? And does it continue to have life beyond just its one moment? Does the algorithm still find value in it? If it's a cut down, if it's a longer version, if it starts at the end and ends at the beginning and you just kind of move the things around, there's a ton of value in there that I think can actually be extremely helpful, both on kind of the upfront awareness gathering side, but also developing things for the back end side. And you can use AI and different things to build those, but AI isn't going to build the plan for you to how to put all these things together to have it make sense. Like you need a person who has a vision and again has a bazillion ideas, and they're just in the queue, and when they're given the ability to do so, they're allowed to crank them out. And so that is sort of being more scientific about the creative side. And I have found that the creative folks at first they're like, what are you trying to do? This sounds complicated and this sounds like more work. And you want how many assets? And the media team is like, you want to test how many things? And it's a lot of pushback because it's a lot of manual work at the moment. But I think the hope is that like, if we can agree to this idea, the tech can evolve to work in this way, but it is more freeing and is more interesting. And you're coming back to your business saying, I am adding value and I know exactly how much value I'm adding and I can prove it because I've got the systems and the analysts to help bring it to life. So it's more structure, but it is allowing you to add, I think, more value to the creative side of the process and not just giving it to the media teams to throw into the black box and they spit out. So yeah, we ran the ads, we got more impressions, we got you to your goal, but it's like I don't know that they always are able to get to the goal in the ideal state. They can sort of get it through automation, but it's not necessarily enriching things for consumers. It's not necessarily creating more interesting jobs for employees, and it's not necessarily explaining why something worked. So it feels like a old model. Sorry, that was a lot of
No, you're good. You're good. I think it's important because you just mentioned there talking about like achieving goals. I think it's really important that when we build measurement into the campaign planning process, one of the most critical things that we have to do is have one clearly stated goals. Your goal can't be everything, right? We have to have clearly stated goals, and then not only that, but the goals have to be like attainable. If it's like, oh, we're going to influence $20 billion of pipeline from this, we've never done 20 billion of pipeline in a year, much less from a campaign. So no, they have to be attainable. But the other thing that has to be in a part of that as well is almost like milestones or mileposts, because if we're measuring impressions, it's an immediate metric. If we're measuring pipeline, that is a lagging metric. And if
Hmm.
you try to measure pipeline on the same timeline that you're measuring impressions, it ain't going to work. The pipeline's always going to miss its goal if we don't give it enough time to fully bake. So those are just some important things that when you're building measurement into that campaign planning process, that we've got to make sure that we spend the time to focus on those things. We can't just gloss over them or just kind of throw some placeholder stuff in there. Like these have to be really well thought out.
And you have to really advocate for them because I see this a lot where it's like, okay, I'm a marketer, I'm told that I need to hit some sort of awareness or consideration or brand lift KPI. But then I've got somebody else coming over the top telling me, like, well, this also needs to drive conversion. And it's like, no. And obviously, not just pushing back with a hard no, but helping educate and explain of like, if you're asking it to do too much, it it's going to fail. And you have a funnel that's doing what you're asking it to do. So if you want that funnel to work harder, then I need to do my part of, setting the stage and building the relationship so that those retention efforts can and conversion efforts can work as hard as they need to. But I feel like in these conversations, it's always like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this upfront brand campaign marketing? Like, well, that doesn't have value. And so we spend a lot of time just educating and saying, well, if it's in its own silo and you're doing it just to do it, yeah, it won't. But if it has a purpose of being connected to the other functions in your organization, it will lift, one and one equals three, kind of, if you're doing it correctly and if you're learning and talking to one another. But again, it's like getting crystal clear is good, but then also having to defend the ground, which is not fun when you're sitting, because it's usually finance or executive leadership that's pushing on this. But this is the thing we care about most. Like, yes, it is, but it's not a one-step process. It is a multi-step process. And hopefully we can get those steps down as few as possible, but that is also part of the learning agenda. Like how many touches does it take to drive conversion, and not just conversion, but long lasting conversion? Back to the phone example, if you knew that you were getting a good deal, plus you knew you had all these benefits, would you be more likely to not only convert, but to stay longer if you had that conversation versus if it was just deal only? And so like these are the things we need to test and learn and prove the value of if you really want to get to ROI. And if bottom line matters, then you got to learn these things.
Yeah, and I think it's important for folks to understand that just because something is the thing we care about most doesn't mean that everything has to address that. Like, okay, cool, we care about MQLs the most. Great. Not everything that we do from a marketing perspective has to influence or generate an MQL. Like we can do other stuff other than MQLs. So I think that's really important to remember because at the same time, not every campaign touches every part of the funnel. So like if you're running a campaign which the stated goal is to generate MQLs and we're engaging primarily with people that are already in our database, you can't have a lead generation target for that type of a campaign because it's not trying to generate leads. So that's why it's so important to be like really specific about what we're trying to accomplish with these campaigns so that we can then turn them into goals that we can and should be measuring against.
Yeah. I think there's also the connection point, which also gets missed. To your point, you've got analytics people that are measuring campaigns or trying to pull together. They're doing great work of like, okay, all these different channels and metrics that all are doing different things and trying to pull it together into one cohesive story. But then you also have, I don't know, campaign work versus channel health work that's going on. And so trying to understand there's stuff that just needs to happen and we need to let it happen and we're going to evaluate it. But where is the intersection of information that's happening and how can we feed into make sure that like we are thinking about a flywheel and you have a ton of first party data and are you leveraging all of it in the right way? And hopefully that's not a ton of each group coming with their presentation to present their information and everybody's kind of sitting in sort of a brown bag lunch but that there's somebody asking key questions and it's like I have a question about something that we want to answer. I want to hear from the social team. I want to hear from the customer service team. I want to hear from the events team, like, and starting to just look at it from different angles to come up with solutions to maybe unlock new things. And so that sort of cross data collaboration, I feel like, is also not happening. Again, technology can come together to help make that easier, but yeah, how data is structured in organizations is usually problem number one. That's been a blocker for lots of different technology advancements, again, personalization, AI implementations, whatever is the next thing to come.
I think that's a big part of the challenge when we don't have a dedicated marketing analyst function, because then what you end up with is you end up with your teams, your event team, your field marketing team, your social team, your brand team. They're all doing their own stuff and they all have their own systems and tools that they use and their own data that they use, but none of it ladders up to marketing to tell a cohesive story about what marketing's doing. Every team has their little, patch of land, and they report on how their patch of land is going. And of course, their patch of land is going great because they're the ones reporting on it. And so you end up with disparate systems, disparate data, and none of it is telling a cohesive story because it's all just everybody's protecting their patch of land. So
Agreed.
We got one more question that I want to get to, and I know we're coming up on time here, but we got one more question I want to get to. We talked a little bit about how regardless of how great your data is, there's sometimes where you just can't understand the why behind why campaigns succeed or fail. And one of the topics that you and I talked about is how B2B can borrow from B2C's use of post-purchase surveys. Tell us a little bit about how you've seen that work.
I feel like, most of the time, any great leader who comes in, to your point about simplification, there's people who come in and they've got a ton of experience and they, want to see all these reports. But the best ones, I feel like, sit and listen and people present their information. It's like, well, why? Why do you think that? Why did that work? And it's like crickets. No one can explain because that was not a question that anybody has really thought about. It's just like, we did the thing, we checked the box. It was wildly successful, 300% lift from, brand lift study. Yeah, let's just go do that again. Like, let's just keep doing it. But no understanding of the seasonality, no understanding of the target, no understanding, was it the creative? Like, what are the elements that drove the value? And so again, it sort of comes back to that plan up front of like, I really need to get to the why. I really need to push questions. Sometimes I feel like, again, on the media side, the more questions that are asked, it's like, oh, well, yeah, we didn't refresh the creative for 6 weeks. So like, tell me why this worked. And it's like, well, there was a lot of lever shifting and we got to the goal, which was a certain amount of impressions and, a certain amount of, clicks or whatever came out of it. And so it is really getting to that understanding of like, if you can't sit in a room and your boss asks you why, then you haven't set it up in the right way and you haven't spent the time on it. So yeah, I feel like, again, a lot of dashboards that are created, a lot of things that I think are delivered sometimes from not necessarily analytics teams, but teams that have access to dashboards and data. And they're just sort of, here's the channel health, or here's that. It's very hard to connect to the like, okay, well then how does that connect to the goal that we're trying to get to? Or what was happening in there that was really working that other folks could work from? If that is not part of your daily thought process, then you're not creating as much value as you could, and there's data that's just being lost and either mismanaged or misused. So it's a little bit of the opportunity cost scenario and a little bit of just like the efficiency and waste. So if we all believe there's efficiency and waste, again, it's starting with that structure and that thinking of like, we've got to be able to say not only what happened, but why it happened. Otherwise, it may not be worth doing.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I found is I think it's a lot easier to understand why something wasn't successful as opposed to why something was successful. Because a lot of times you can point to like, well, that image is actually a mismatch with our ICP, or this copy is problematic and confusing. Like it's easier to find out the why it didn't work than why it did work. And I think a lot of that is because that a lot of the why did something work, a lot of that can be hidden. So like one of the things that I always use as an example of this is you can show data that says, oh, this campaign performed great. We got this huge opportunity and they engaged with this campaign and that's great. And then you look back at the opportunity and it's like, the real reason we won the opportunity is because the buyer is best friends with our VP of sales. Did they engage with the campaign along the way? Yes, they did. But they're best friends. They were going to buy no matter what. The data tells us the campaign was successful, but the why is actually the relationship to the VP of sales. And that's the type of stuff that like post-purchase surveys, like that's the only way to uncover that type of a why is through a post-purchase survey. You can't, the data is never going to show that because there's no data point on an opportunity that says best friends with VP of sales. Like that just doesn't exist on an opportunity. So, and to get sales to acknowledge that would never happen either because sales would be like, no, I sold it. It has nothing to do with it. They're best friends. I sold it. So it's just, there's certain things that cannot be uncovered without things like post-purchase surveys. And so it's really important to try to get as much of that context as possible.
Yeah. And again, I think if you're able to do sort of pre-launch testing and focus groups, like you're starting to narrow down the number of unknowns or things of like, yes, we feel like, is this the most amazing piece of creative in the world? Maybe, maybe not. But it's good enough. It's progress over perfection. It's starting a conversation. And so then hopefully when you get to the post-survey, you're now limiting the things of like, okay, I really want to know some of these other components that I wasn't able to sort of hypothesize or learn along the way. Some of the brand lift studies are interesting though, because the media team requires so many different things as a part of it that they were like, I would never have put that in there if the Facebook or Meta or whoever wasn't requiring that it be, a logo in the first 3 seconds. Well, it screams like an ad. So yes, it's going to be less effective than if it wasn't screaming like an ad. So there's, we've had those issues too of like, you've got a brand and then a logo, product logo, and the brand survey comes back. Well, I thought this was we're thinking, they're going to think it's very clearly this brand or this product. And it's like, there's some other component in there. Like, I thought this is a phone ad. I thought this was a computer ad. Like, it's like we've sort of missed the boat on just got in our own heads of overthinking things. And so you're right. Some of those things can come back and just help you simplify what, we did too much. We overthought it. Do less. This is what we learned from the brand lift study.
So you make an interesting point about focus groups, and that's something that like B2C does a ton of, but B2B barely ever does, at least in my experience. And I think B2B companies, anybody that's with a B2B company that's listening to this right now and is thinking about, focus groups, how can I do that? If you already have a customer advisory board, that is your focus group. That's your focus group to do your testing with. Most of you have a customer advisory board and you're struggling to figure out how to activate that customer advisory board. Focus groups right there. That's your group. Okay, so we're running up on time. I always like to close these out with kind of just like a replay of some of the key takeaways that I heard. It's the too long didn't listen part. So a couple of the key takeaways that I heard is that it's important to start with a hypothesis and then use the data to help prove or disprove that hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we prove the hypothesis and that's great. And other times you actually get some new insights that you hadn't even thought of before. So, but you have to start with a hypothesis because you can't just run into a suite of data and say, what's it going to tell me? It doesn't work that way. You got to start with a hypothesis. Another one is that analytics and strategy need to sit in lockstep with one another, preferably part of the same team within marketing. They've got to be tied at the hip. Totally agree. Campaigns need to iterate. They cannot just be left alone. They can't be set it and forget it. As a matter of fact, you mentioned that when you see the ads for all of these software platforms that are like, you can just set it and forget it and it'll run. And you're like, nope, I don't want any part of that. No, that sounds awful. Another one is that building measurement has to include milestones so that we're measuring things at the appropriate time so that we give things time to bake. And then lastly here is that getting to the why is so important because it leads to the right questions, what was working and what wasn't, but really helps us understand so that we can replicate it or prevent it from happening again. It also helps to not mismanage data, because data without context can totally be used for all sorts of wrong purposes. So you have to have as much context as you possibly can to help really, make that data actionable. So those were the key takeaways. So Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and experience and expertise with our listeners. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and best of luck to you with Consiglieri. And thanks again.
Thank you. This has been fun and cathartic at the same time.